The sound of my father's fork tapping crystal cut clean through the dining room, the way it always did when he wanted the table to fall silent for him. 22 of us crammed around 2 folding tables, pushed end to end. The good tablecloth my mother only used for Thanksgiving, the turkey gone cold while everyone waited to see what speech he'd give this year. He stood, glass of his cheap Merlot raised, and he was smiling the way he smiled at his insurance clients, all teeth and no eyes. "This year," he said, "your brother's getting back on his feet, and we've decided as a family that you're going to be the one to make sure he stays there. The mortgage, the line of credit, whatever he needs, you're in a position to carry it. It's time." He didn't ask. He announced it. Like he was reading the score of a hockey game. The room did that thing where everyone breathes in at once and nobody breathes out. My aunt's hand stopped halfway to the gravy boat. My cousins looked at their plates. And then my mother, who'd been sitting beside me the whole night refilling my water like she actually cared, leaned in close enough that I could smell the hairspray, and she said, "Quiet, just for me. And if you say no, sweetheart, don't bother coming home for Christmas or any other day." I want to tell you I was shocked. I wasn't. What I felt, sitting there in my dead grandmother's chair with a paper napkin in my lap, was something closer to relief. Like a door I'd been leaning against my whole life had finally swung open and I could just step through it. I set my own glass down. I stood up slow. I made sure my hands weren't shaking, because they weren't. "Then this is the last drink I'll ever raise in this house," I said, "and the last dollar any of you will ever see from me." Nobody laughed. My uncle's chair creaked. Somebody's kid asked if there was pie, and my father's smile finally cracked at the corners, because for the first time in 30 years I'd said a word he hadn't scripted for me. "My name is Sloane Whitford. I'm 29. I'm the older one, the steady one, the one who got out of our little town outside Sudbury and made something of herself in the city, which in my family meant I was the one with the checkbook. For most of my adult life, I had been less a daughter than a department, accounts receivable. My raises were planning sessions. My bonuses had destinations before they ever hit my account. My younger brother sat across from me through all of it, eyes down, turning his wine glass in slow circles, saying nothing. He never had to say anything. Silence had always paid for him better than words ever could. I didn't slam any doors when I left. I thanked my aunt for the squash. I told my little cousin there was definitely pie. It was in the kitchen. And then I got in my car and pulled out of the gravel driveway I'd grown up on, and I drove the 4 hours back to the city with the radio off, because I needed to hear myself think. And what I was thinking was, they have no idea what they just did. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand how it started and how slow it was, the way these things always are. Nobody hands you a contract the first time. It comes in small asks. My brother started university the same year I started my first real job. He went away to school in another province, and within 8 months he dropped out, come home, and decided he was an entrepreneur. That was the word my father used. Entrepreneur, not unemployed, not lost, never in trouble. My brother had ventures. He had ideas. The first was a clothing line he never got past designing the logo for. Then a vape shop that the city shut down inside a year. Then a food truck he convinced 2 of his buddies to invest in, which is a sentence that already tells you how it ended. And every single time the thing collapsed, the phone rang in my apartment. The first ask was $400 for rent. I remember it so clearly because it felt like nothing. I had it. He was my baby brother. My mother got on the phone and said he was just going through a rough patch. He was so stressed, it would mean so much. So I sent it. E-transfer. 3 taps on my phone. Password, family123. I'm not even joking. The next one was $1,200. Then it was clearing the last of his food truck debt before it went to collections, because a collections mark would ruin his credit, and how would he ever get a real start in life with bad credit? That one was almost $9,000. I moved money out of my RRSP to cover part of it and ate the tax penalty without telling anyone, because I was 25 and I thought love was supposed to cost you something. Here's what I want you to understand. I never got a thank you that wasn't immediately followed by a new request. My mother would call and tell me I was the strong one, the smart one, the one she didn't have to worry about, and I'd glow for about 90 seconds before she got to the actual reason she'd called. I learned to wait for it. The compliment was the wind-up. The ask was the pitch. I told myself it would stop once he stabilized. That was the word I used in my own head for years. Stabilized. Like he was a patient. Like one day he'd just level out and the calls would stop and we'd all go for brunch and laugh about the lean years. It never stopped. It only got more expensive. Meanwhile, I was doing what people in my family apparently couldn't see because I made it look easy. I was working 60-hour weeks at a logistics firm, getting promoted, skipping vacations, saying no to 1,000 small things I wanted so I could keep saying yes to them. I bought a small condo. I built up savings. I had a guy I'd been seeing, a kind, patient guy who once asked me, gently, why I cried after every phone call from home, and I broke up with him 3 weeks later because I didn't want to answer that question. The worst part, and I mean the part that still sits in my chest some nights, is that they genuinely believed I owed them, not as a favor, as a debt. Like the fact that I'd managed to build something stable made me responsible for the fact that he hadn't. So when my father stood up at that Thanksgiving table and announced I'd be taking over my brother's mortgage and his line of credit, he wasn't asking me to do something new. In his mind, he was just formalizing an arrangement that had been running for years. He was making the silent thing loud, and the only reason it landed differently this time, the only reason I stood up instead of nodding and reaching for my phone, was the word mortgage. Because, here's the thing, nobody at that table knew I'd already figured out. A year earlier, my brother had asked me to co-sign something. I'll get there. Let me tell it in order, because the order is the whole point. The morning after Thanksgiving, my mother showed up at my condo. Unannounced, 4 hours of driving. Coat still buttoned to her chin. Standing in my hallway like she was the one who'd been wronged. She didn't take her boots off, which in my family is basically a declaration of war. You need to fix this, she said, before I'd even closed the door. I made coffee. I didn't offer her any, and then I felt guilty and offered her some, which tells you everything about how deep the training went. She sat at my little kitchen island and told me my brother hadn't slept, that he was a wreck, that my father was humiliated in front of the whole family. Did I understand how it looked, the daughter walking out at Thanksgiving? I reminded her, very calmly, that I'd cleared his collections debt in the spring, that I'd paid 2 months of his rent over the summer, that my savings weren't a bottomless well, that I had my own mortgage, my own retirement to think about, that I was 29 and I had nothing saved that they hadn't already spent twice. She laughed at me. I will never forget it. A short, disbelieving laugh, like I'd said something adorable and stupid. You make good money, she said. You'll be fine. He won't. He doesn't have what you have. You can always make more. It's different for him. And there it was. The whole ugly architecture of it, said out loud at last. I wasn't a person who'd worked for something. I was a renewable resource, a well they could keep going back to because the well, apparently, refilled itself. My brother was fragile, irreplaceable, precious. I was durable. I could take it. That afternoon, my brother called. Not to apologize. Not to say maybe this was too much to put on me. One line, in this small, wounded voice he'd been using since he was 9 years old to get out of trouble. Why are you punishing me? And something in me just went quiet and clear, like the surface of a lake at 5 in the morning. Because that was the question, wasn't it? In his world, my refusal to keep funding his life was an act of aggression against him. Not me protecting myself, me attacking him. He genuinely could not conceive of a version of events where I was anything other than the bank, and the bank had just done something unforgivable, which was close. I didn't punish you, I told him. I just stopped paying for you. Those aren't the same thing. He hung up on me. 3 days later, my father escalated. He's a man who believes deeply in the power of an audience. He invited the extended family to the house to clear the air, and like an idiot, like a person who still believed honesty counted for something with these people, I drove the 4 hours back. I walked into my parents' living room, and there were 20 faces turned toward me. Aunts, uncles, my mother's church friends, a couple of cousins I hadn't seen in years. My mother sat dead center on the couch like a judge at a hearing. My brother beside her, eyes down, hands folded, performing fragility so well he should have won something for it. My father stood up. He used my full name, which he never does unless he's about to do something cruel. "We're all worried about Sloane," he said to the room, "about the choices she's making. She's decided to turn her back on her own brother when he needs her most, after everything this family has done for her." A murmur went around the room like wind through wheat. One of my aunts shook her head slowly, sadly at me. I heard somebody near the kitchen say the word selfish, not even quietly. I opened my mouth. My mother raised one hand, palm out, the way you'd stop traffic. "This isn't a discussion," she said. "This is about you taking responsibility." And that was the moment. That was the one that actually burned, that I can still feel on my skin if I think about it too long. Because they weren't just demanding money anymore. They were standing in front of 20 witnesses, rewriting the last decade of my life in real time, turning a woman who'd quietly given them the better part of $40,000 into the villain of the story. Nobody mentioned the transfers. Nobody mentioned the night I drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to bail my brother out of a situation I'm still not allowed to talk about. None of that existed in this room. In this room, I was the rich daughter who'd abandoned her family. My face went hot. My hands started to shake, and for one humiliating second I thought I was going to cry in front of all of them and prove their version right. But it wasn't sadness shaking my hands. It took me a moment to recognize it because I'd never let myself feel it before. It was rage. Cold, clean, useful rage. I didn't say anything. I want you to understand that because it's the most important thing I did that whole night. I didn't defend myself. I didn't lay out the receipts. I didn't beg 20 people to believe me. I looked at my father, and I looked at my mother, and I looked at my brother who still wouldn't meet my eyes, and I picked up my coat off the back of the couch and I left. The silence I left behind me was louder than anything I could have said. I could feel it pressing on the front door as I closed it. I drove home in the dark, and somewhere around the halfway point on that long, empty stretch of highway where the radio turns to static and there's nothing but black trees on either side, I stopped feeling humiliated and started feeling something a lot more useful. I started thinking like the operations manager I actually was. Because that's my job, in real life. I find the leak in a system and I close it. And I realized I had been treating my family like a relationship I had to win, when really it was a system I had to exit. I got home near midnight. I didn't cry. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same one my mother had laughed at me across a few days earlier, and I opened my laptop and I poured myself exactly 1 glass of wine and I got to work. The first thing I did was pull 7 years of bank statements. Every institution, every account. I'd switched banks twice in that time, and I logged into all of them. And I built a spreadsheet, the way I build them at work, clean columns, dates, amounts, a notes field. E-transfers to my brother. Checks to my parents that I knew had passed straight through to him. The RRSP withdrawal and the tax I'd eaten on it. The collections payout. Rent. Legal fees that one terrible October. By the time I was done, it was almost 3 in the morning, and the number at the bottom of the column was $43,620. I looked at that number for a long time. I didn't feel sad about it exactly. It was more like finally seeing the x-ray of a bone you'd known was broken for years. But the spreadsheet wasn't the reason I'd opened the laptop. The spreadsheet was just me warming up. The real reason was a folder I'd been avoiding for a year, and now I opened it. About 14 months earlier, my brother had come to me with a deal. A real one, he swore. A legitimate one this time. A friend of his had a line on a restaurant space downtown. Turnkey, just needed working capital, and the bank would give him a substantial line of credit to get going, but his credit was wrecked from the food truck, so he needed a cosigner. Just on paper, he said. Just a formality. My father got on the phone and told me it was completely safe, that my brother had a real business plan this time, that all I was doing was helping him qualify, that I'd never actually have to pay anything because the restaurant would carry it. I trusted them. I shouldn't have. I signed. And the restaurant, of course, did exactly what every other venture of his had done. It limped along for 10 months and folded. And here's where my family's understanding of the world and the actual world part ways, violently. In their minds, when my brother walked away from that restaurant, the debt walked away with him. It was his thing. It failed. Oh well, on to the next idea. Can Sloane help? But I had signed my name as a cosigner on a $40,000 line of credit. And that night, at 3 in the morning, I finally did the thing I'd been too scared to do for 14 months. I read every single page of what I'd signed. I'd been telling myself I was the safety net for my brother. That's not what the document said. The document said I was the borrower, not a backup, not a moral support. A borrower, equally and fully liable, the bank's words, jointly and severally. If he didn't pay, they didn't politely ask me to help. They came after me, my condo, my wages, all of it with the full weight of the law. The whole time I'd thought I was being generous. I'd actually been one missed payment away from losing everything I'd built. That's the moment it stopped being about feelings. You can argue with someone about feelings forever. My family had been winning the feelings argument my entire life. But you cannot argue your way out of a signature on a line of credit, and you cannot guilt your way out of a guarantor obligation. And once I understood that, I understood exactly what I had to do, and none of it involved a single conversation with any of them. I want to be honest about something because I've watched enough of these stories to know people will say in the comments, "Oh, you can't just walk away from a cosign. That's not how it works." And they're right, and that's exactly the point. I couldn't just decide I was done, so I didn't decide. I did the work. The Monday after that family meeting, I called the bank, the actual lending bank, and I asked the only question that mattered, which was, what is the current balance on this line of credit, and what do I have to do to get my name released from it? The answer was not pleasant. My brother had drawn the line nearly to its limit and had stopped making even the minimum payments 2 months earlier. The account was sliding toward default, with my name on it. So here's what I did, and I did it cold, like a project at work. I had the savings my family thought existed only to be spent on them. I used a chunk of it, the most painful check I have ever written in my life, and I paid that line of credit down to 0 myself. Not as a gift to my brother, as an amputation, because as long as that balance existed, I was chained to him, and I was buying my freedom. And then I got the bank to do the one thing my family never thought I'd do. I got my name off it, in writing. Account closed, no further draws possible, guarantor released. I made them email it to me. I printed it and I put it in a fireproof box. The same week I sat down with a lawyer, a sharp, unsentimental woman who charged me $350 an hour and was worth every loonie. I didn't go to her to sue anyone. I told her I wasn't interested in revenge through the courts, which was true. I went to make absolutely certain there was no other thread connecting my finances to my family that I didn't know about. We went through everything. She drafted a letter, very polite, very professional, that went to my brother and copied to my parents. stating in plain language that I had no remaining financial obligation to any member of my family, that I would not be a guarantor, cosigner, or lender on any future arrangement, and that any further requests of that nature would be considered harassment. And then, having closed every leak in the system, I did the only thing left to do. Nothing. I went completely silent. No replies to texts, no answering calls, no long explanatory message about my feelings. I'd spent 30 years explaining myself to people who'd already decided not to listen, and I was done writing essays nobody read. The silence was the strategy. The silence was the whole thing. It took about 2 days for the system to start collapsing now that I'd stopped holding it up. My brother's rent didn't get paid because I wasn't paying it. A payment he'd been counting on from somewhere bounced. Whatever fragile little arrangement of borrowed time he'd been living on, it had load-bearing walls made out of me, and I'd walked out of the building. My phone lit up. My mother first, then my brother, then my father, then my mother again. The calls getting closer together, the voicemails getting shorter and higher and less rehearsed. My father called, and when I finally, just once, picked up, he said in this tight voice I'd never heard him use, "What did you do?" I let the silence stretch. I'd learned that from him, actually. "I stopped," I said. "That's all. I just stopped." And I hung up. 2 weeks after the family meeting, they came to my door. Both my parents, no warning, having made the drive again. I opened it and they were standing in my hallway looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. My father's coat too big on him suddenly. My mother's mouth pulled tight. "You've made your point," my mother said. "You can stop now. He's in real trouble, Sloane. Real trouble this time." I noticed my brother wasn't with them. That told me everything I needed to know about how this family allocates responsibility. "You're the only one who can help him," my father said. And then, the part that I think he genuinely believed would work. The part that finally made me understand I'd been free for 2 weeks already and just hadn't fully felt it. "We're your family." I looked at the two of them standing in my doorway, and I felt something I'd been waiting my whole life to feel and never had, which was nothing. No guilt, no old reflex reaching for my phone, no little girl inside me desperate to be the good daughter. Just a clean, quiet, enormous nothing. "I helped," I said. "For years. You just never noticed it was help, because you thought it was owed." My mother reached for my arm, the same move she'd used my whole life. The touch that came right before the ask. I stepped back out of her reach. "So that's it," my father said, and there was real bewilderment in it, like a man watching the rules of physics break. "You're just going to walk away from your own family." I almost laughed, but I didn't, because it wasn't funny, it was just finally clear. "No," I said, "I'm not walking away. I'm walking forward. There's a difference. You just never let me face it before." I closed the door. I didn't slam it. I just closed it, the way you close a book you finished. And I listened to their footsteps go back down the hall, and the building was quiet. And the quiet was mine. I heard later, through one of my cousins who'd quietly slipped me a text after the family meeting, the only one of them who ever did, that my brother had finally hit the wall. There was no one left to soften. The restaurant landlord, the bank, all of it came due at once, with no Sloane underneath it to break the fall. He moved back in with my parents. I don't know all the details, and I've made a point of not finding out, because the details were never my responsibility. That was the entire lesson I'd had to learn at 29. My cousin asked me, in that text, if I felt bad, and I sat with the question because I wanted to answer it honestly, not performatively. The truth is, I felt sad. There's a difference between feeling sad and feeling guilty, and it took me almost 30 years and $43,000 to learn it. I was sad that my brother had been raised to believe consequences were something that happened to other people. I was sad that my parents loved the version of me that was useful and had never once gone looking for the version that was just their daughter. I was sad in the way you're sad about weather. About something true and large that you didn't cause and can't fix? But guilty? No. You can't feel guilty for stopping something you should never have started. It's almost a year later now. I went through the holidays for the first time in my adult life without a single phone call asking me for money. And I'll be honest, the silence was strange at first, like a sound you don't notice until it stops. The way you don't hear the fridge humming until it clicks off and the kitchen goes still. I kept waiting for the buzz of my phone. It didn't come. After a few weeks, I stopped waiting. I started doing things that don't make any sense if you measure a life in transfers and obligations. I took a pottery class. I'm terrible at it. I have 4 lopsided mugs that don't hold liquid properly, and I love every one of them because nobody asked me to make them. I started talking to that patient guy again, slowly, no promises, and the first thing I told him was the answer to the question he'd asked me years ago about why I cried after every call home. He listened to the whole thing without saying a word, and at the end he just said, "That wasn't your job," and I cried again, but it was a different kind of crying. Last week, I put the last of the money back into my RRSP, the part I'd pulled out at 25 and eaten the penalty on, the first money in years that's just sitting there growing for nobody but me. I looked at the balance and I felt rich, and I'm not. I just felt like I belonged to myself, which it turns out is its own kind of rich. I think about that Thanksgiving table sometimes. The cold turkey, the good tablecloth, my father standing up with his glass like he was handing out a promotion, my mother's voice in my ear telling me the price of staying in the family. They thought the money was an obligation I owed by blood. They were wrong about the deepest thing a person can be wrong about. It was never an obligation. Everything I gave them, every single dollar, was a choice. And the day I understood, that was the day I got to make a different one. People ask me, the few people I tell this to, whether I'd do it again, whether I'd cut my own family off over money. And I tell them they've got the question backwards. I didn't cut them off over money. The money was just the thing I could finally see clearly, the one part of the trap that came with a paper trail. What I cut off was the lie that love means never letting the people you love feel the weight of their own lives. I poured myself a glass of wine tonight, by my own window in my own quiet condo, and I didn't raise it to anger and I didn't raise it to winning, because it wasn't either of those things. I raised it to the version of me who sat at that table with shaking hands and finally, after 30 years, decided she was allowed to put the glass down. To the people who only miss you when the checks stop. May you learn, slowly, the long hard way, the thing I had to learn, and may it cost you exactly what it costs. I raised my glass to the dark window and to the silence, and the silence, for the first time in my life, was entirely mine. The thing nobody warns you about is how quiet freedom is when it finally arrives. I spent 30 years bracing for the day my family fell apart, and when it came, it didn't sound like anything at all. It sounded like a phone that didn't buzz. I've thought a lot about why it all unraveled the way it did, and the honest answer is that none of it was an accident. My brother stopped being able to stand on his own, because every single time he wobbled, someone, usually me, slid a floor under him. You can't learn to catch yourself if you've never once been allowed to fall. My parents kept asking because asking had always worked, and it had always worked because I'd never made it stop. Cause and effect, plain as a ledger. The day I closed the line of credit and went silent wasn't cruelty. It was just the first time the math was allowed to be true. What got me out wasn't anger, even though I had plenty of it. It was 3 things I had to build the hard way, none of which my upbringing handed me for free. The first was learning to tell the difference between being good and being useful. For most of my life, I thought saying yes was kindness, when really it was just fear wearing a nicer coat. Real decency, I figured out, sometimes looks like letting someone you love feel the full weight of their own choices. The second was the willingness to actually read the page. For 14 months, I avoided that co-signing document because I was scared of what it said, and fear is just ignorance you've decided not to fix. The moment I sat down and read every line, the moment I built that spreadsheet at 3 in the morning, I stopped being a victim of the situation and started being someone who understood it. Clear eyes change everything. You can't out-argue a feeling, but you can out-think a trap. And the third was simply staying the course when everyone I loved was telling me I was the villain. Standing in that living room with 20 people calling me selfish and saying nothing, walking out, holding the silence for 2 weeks while my phone screamed at me, paying that brutal check to buy back my own name. That took a kind of stubborn endurance I didn't know I had until I needed it. I'm not special. I want to be really clear about that. I was just a tired daughter who finally got tired enough to do the work. If there's anything in my story worth taking with you, it's that the life you keep paying for isn't the one you're meant to live. Be kind, but don't confuse it with surrender. Look hard at the things you're afraid to look at, and when you finally put the glass down, keep it down.